Hello, and welcome to M&A's Church Planting and Renewal Conversations. I'm Chris Vogel, Director of Next Gen Pastors, and serve M&A as the Director of Ecosystems Development. For many in the U.S., Canada is just like America, but maybe more polite. What is more, for many in our own denomination, there's a woeful ignorance of the state of the church in Canada, especially when it comes to what the PCA is doing. A number of years ago, Ed Stetzer and Daniel M. published a study of the state of the church in Canada. They reported how churches in Canada grow more slowly, with a widening gap between the U.S. and Canada when it comes to new commitments to Christ year by year. They stated, and I quote, "The U.S. religious climate has been historically different than the Canadian one. Consequently, the patterns that lead to successful church planting in the U.S. are often different than those in Canada. Canada's post-Christian context is more similar to many countries in Europe, where the liftoff for church plants is somehow slower, takes more perseverance, and is not yet at the multiplication level occurring in many parts of the United States. To gain a better insight into what the Lord is doing in one segment of the church in Canada, we have several leaders from the Grace Network. The Grace Network is a collection of Canadian churches and pastors that are reformed, missional, gospel-centered, and prayerful. They are on an ambitious plan to train more young people for ministry, plant more churches, help churches get back on mission, and multiply churches that are thriving. Well, I'm pleased to have with us today Conan Kubelik. He's the current director of the Grace Network. He also serves as senior pastor of New City Church in Hamilton, Ontario, where he and his wife Brenda planted back in 2007. They have four kids that are, well, at least for the most part, in the teenage years. Dan McDonald currently serves as senior pastor for Grace Toronto Church, which he started back with his wife in 2005. Grace Toronto has planted two congregations over the past 5 years and has seen three of its interns go on to plant churches in Toronto and Ottawa. Dan served as the director of the Grace Network for 4 years until 2017. He's married to Sue, and they have a 13-year-old daughter. Scott McDowell is a church planter and pastor in Victoria, British Columbia. He and his wife, Linnea, planted Lighthouse Church 8 years ago. He serves also on the board. He's a board member of the Grace Network, oversees its intern and apprenticeship program. The McDowells are parents of 3 teens. And then Ben Jolliffe and his wife, Jen, moved to Ottawa, Ontario in 2014 to plant Resurrection Church, where he currently serves as senior pastor. He also serves on the board of the Grace Network and oversees its summer intensive programs. Ben and Jen have 4 kids. Well, welcome, guys. I'm glad to have you with us. And for those who are attending, let me just start off by just saying to those who are attending, we've got the chat box, the Q&A box. Please make use of those. If you have any questions, throw them out. Any thoughts, anything else you want to hear about. We like to keep this as interactive as we can with our panel and with the attendees. Well, let me just begin with a kind of a basic question as people, especially if we're coming from our denominational stance and polity. What's a network? Why a network? Why? This is what the presbytery does. Is there any benefit that you might want to tell us that comes with a network? Anyone?
Well, I think there's a number of benefits that come with a network. I mean, we can explore that together, but I mean, I think one of them is for us, and it kind of came why the network was formed back in 2007, was for a country that's very geographically dispersed. You know, we're the second largest country in the world by land mass. It allowed for a bit of a national vision. You know, it's a challenge because we're scattered across a great divide, but it allows us to work together across just natural, places where you would naturally cluster, to send interns other places, to look at, places where there are no current plants that, we're connected to. But, I think then you work with presbyteries. In the Eastern Canada Presbytery, there's been a good relationship here. I was the former one before Ben took over, but I think they've worked well together there. And, I think a network in places can fill in gaps that presbyteries might find harder to do. And it's not that the presbyteries necessarily can't do it. it's just sometimes that's not in their scope of what they're looking at.
So the Grace Network covers all of Canada.
Yeah, so it's working with both sides of the country. So Scott's on the west coast, about as far west as you can get, not quite, but almost. And we've got now a new plant working and gathering a group in Halifax. So we are coast to coast with mini gaps in between.
Yeah, I mean, that geographical distance is probably one of the greatest components. The thing I'm in the West Coast, and so all the guys on the panel I only get to see through our Grace Network interactions, because often presbyteries don't interact with other presbyteries, and they've influenced my ministries and the things I've been a part of over the many years, and the people we work with together. It's really, and the people who've made it from one side of the country to the other haven't necessarily made it because of presbytery connections, but because of network connections. Mm-hmm. And so it blesses our presbytery to have new leaders, ministry leaders coming into different parts of the country. And it really has to come through some of the strategic connections that come through in network relationships.
And I find, I think this gets to another question you have, Chris, but networks do things better than presbyteries do, and probably vice versa. Presbytery sets really good doctrinal boundaries, ethical boundaries. Here's where the playing field is. Here's out of bounds. That's great. But what plays do you call for what specific moment in the game? They don't tell you those things. You need, coaching. You need training, and I feel like presbyteries just aren't set up well to do that kind of coaching for the different seasons of life and how to do church planting and how to do contextual exegesis of your community. So there's some specific skill sets that networks tend to give you that, as a practical church planner, presbyteries just don't tend to have in their suitcase. So I felt like as I was growing my church plan, I just needed mutual encouragement. I needed people who had my specific questions they had answers to. Mm-hmm. And networks just do those in real time just so much better than presbytery, especially our presbyteries. How often do we meet, guys? 2-3 times a year? Yeah. Right? So I can't wait 5 months to figure out how to get rid of the picketer in front of my church, So.
Yeah. Okay. Well, good. Yeah. So in that, then it sounds like what the network does, it provides also the avenue for interpresbytery communications and encouragement, so that you're actually multiplying the efforts to know what's happening in one region, and then you can transfer that over. No, that's great. So, how many churches are in the Grace Network right now, and what's its history? How does it function? How is it organized and set up?
We've planted since 2007 about 14 churches. There's a number of other established churches that play a part in offering internships, helping fund. So there's churches across the country and plants across the country, again, with many gaps in between that, over the decades, we are praying we can be a part of filling in. But, there's probably about 20 some churches that play some sort of role. I mean, it's, some are very actively involved, others less so, but, there's been a number of churches across the country. We were started with PCA leadership, so we still have that. It's deeply connected to that, but we've also partnered with other plants, other denominations, and even other networks across the country to help plant churches. I mean, a number of us work with Incubator that, City to City has started, but another church planting network plays a part in leading in the country. So there's been a number of very interesting and beneficial opportunities. I mean, and hiccups along the way, obviously, with those as well. But it's been a good opportunity to connect not only with PCA churches, but with a number of others as well. I regularly have guys in my region, or sometimes even denominational leaders, just come. We've got a guy that maybe wants to plant, or we'd like a church in an area, help us. We've never really planted in a number of years, or we've only kind of got one way that we've ever done it, but we don't think that's going to work here. So I think it's been an opportunity for us to work collaboratively, not only within our denomination, but in other ways as well across other places.
Yeah. So sounds like some healthy cross-pollination that goes on. I think that's great. So let's just, what does it look like as you're going to start working with the church as a network? What do you provide? What's the context there?
Well, one of the things about our network that's unusual is we don't have a full-time sort of, staff member. It's a bunch of church planners running it, which has its strengths and weaknesses, right, Ben? Ben's talked about this a few times, and so has everybody who's looked at us. It's like, if you really want to make hay, in some senses, you could use a full-time staff, but we're a little thin on the ground. One of the things about the Grace Network is it's just a bunch of busy church planners with a vision. So there's unbelievable collegiality. And so we're run pretty collegially. It's like the five of us plus a couple more people basically get together and make decisions on it. And so it's pastoral, it's collegial. It has its weaknesses, but I don't know, how many PCA churches are there in Canada now? 25 or so?
Something like that.
Like that. Yeah. And 14 of them were planted in the last 14 years by the network. So we've really kind of
amazing
helped put the PCA roots into Canada, where it was pretty fledgling. Most of the churches when I got here in 2005 were churches that had been in the RPCES and had become PCA by merger. They had a very different culture, very different thought, not very missional particularly. And so this was also a part to try and embed a missional culture within our own denomination and to work with others, simply because it needed that renewal of kind of missional culture and missional urgency.
Like Chris, some of the things we do, like we're hopefully running an assessment this fall. And no offense to Americans, but like, because of the cultural differences, it makes sense to have our own assessment of like guys or couples that would really, survive or thrive in a Canadian context. Yeah. And so that's one of the things we do. And we regularly get people from outside our denomination, taking part in that. We have a conference. We've done a conference a few times. We haven't had one now, for COVID era plus 6 months or something like that. So, but hoping, spring of 2022 to do something. And so, and press conference is not hundreds of people. I think the last one, like 33 people came or something like that. And so really it's sort of like a small group discussion of pressing issues. We usually hire a speaker to come in and give us some stuff to chew on or whatever, but mostly we like eat food together and hang out and encourage each other. And so there's some of those things going on. And then we usually partner on the incubator and stuff we do the other church plant networks, but so there's like kind of pieces of things that come together.
Okay. Yeah, the scaffolding sort of been built over a long period of time with a lot of people who are working this as a side job that pays nothing. So it's a matter of working
and cost everything
working together to try to get good thing happening. We do want to work with interns and apprentices. So we sort of divided out into the network in two different capacities. So we want to see people who go through assessment become apprentices for church planting and take a 2-year time of working within a context of a church plant. Sometimes a church that's not necessarily a church plant anymore, but has that ability to give them that kind of experience. And that can be anywhere in the country. And then we create a relationship with that church to create an experience where they have to go through incubator over that 2 years. They have to sort of meet some of the learning goals of their assessment. And then then there's also interns who are pre-assessment and have a year to move towards getting that assessment done, but they can also be right away in a context of a church planting scenario where they're watching a church planter or watching a team do church planting work. And so we still want to create more of a farm system of helping people get involved because not only do church plants take a long time, but it seems like church planters are starting to take a long time to develop, and they don't just come out of seminary and ready to go and kind of thing. And so it's a need for developing people to feel more ready for the task.
Yeah. I've heard the word incubator twice. What is that?
So the incubator is a curriculum that came out of Redeemer in New York originally, and it's been it's a 16 modules, about 4 hours of work, reading work a month, and then they meet together for about 5 hours of training that month. So it's a pretty heavy commitment, actually. But in the end, it creates a lot of camaraderie with a group of people in a city that's doing it. So there would be planters. The way we're doing it in Victoria is it's one planter in our church, or planter apprentice in our church, and then 6 others from different denominations that have been joined in. And so it's a way in which our network can bless other people. And so we train together for the 2 years, and it ends up being that those are the guys that really contact us and need on the ground help and stuff like that. So as we start these training cohorts in different parts of the country, it really leads to a lot more connection and new people coming into wanting to think about planting with the network. So because, training is one of those aspects, we've in the past, the PC we prided ourselves on, but really is not existing at this time. So this is a point I think be helpful for us to learn. So someone that's starting in that process, you said 16 modules over how long of a period?
2 years.
About 2 years.
About 2 years. So do they start when they begin their apprenticeship, or do they start when they're done with their apprenticeship before they go off to plant?
Yes.
The incubator is a bit of both.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So you sort of take guys that are
a mixed bag.
Okay. Nope. And that's
Sorry,
good.
Scott.
There's a bit of fluidity as to when they start. It's a fairly urban, it's a Redeemer New York centric theological vision that drives it. So it has a lot of their kind of training in it. And if you've read Center Church, you'll have probably got some of the principles, but
right.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, good. So, and in that process, so they're working on their own and then come together as a cohort throughout that time. So they're getting good relational connections with guys who are at the same process, more or less.
Right. Yeah. Like even through the incubator, I think what's nice about it is if it's taken seriously by the students involved in it, they actually come out with a prospectus for a plant. So they can actually, over the 2 years, be writing a theological, practical vision for what their church plant would look like. So they could walk out the door with that in their hand, ready to start raising support and moving forward towards that. So it's practical in that sense, is that it gets you moving. It also, just helps fill in the blanks with some of the gospel centrality that's missing with a lot of planters who have come into they want to reach people for Christ. They want to make a difference, but having some really helpful tools to say, like, what does it mean to point people to Christ, to come to faith and to live like with Christ in the center of life as you walk in the faith, and calling people to have Jesus in the center of your church is a helpful piece to the puzzle of training.
Right. Okay. I'm impressed too. You had said there's 25 PCA churches now, right? And 14 of them have been plants in the last, how many years? 10 years?
It's about
15.
2007. Yeah.
About 14.
About 14 years. Okay. Well, it's okay. So on average, one plant a year, but that means, you have tripled your size in the last 14 years. Which is amazing. That is wonderful.
Yeah, when we went to Eastern Canada Presbytery the very first time, I was the only church plant they'd seen in, I think, ever. And now when we go to Eastern Canada Presbytery, it's like 80% church plants and church planters or planted churches now, starting to do internships. So it's the whole Eastern Canada Presbytery has been completely transformed. It's been kind of fun to watch.
Yeah.
I think the secret is you just can't have any other church jobs. So if you want to be a pastor in Canada, you have to plant a church. And so because there's just not very many that exist. So that's you want to grow your network, just have no other churches you can work at. So
it's a pretty high bar. Church plant or die,
Yeah.
So there's just not a lot of big churches.
Yeah.
So what we do is we just go to the campus ministries and we rob and steal all their best people. That's how we found Ben. He was a major leader in a campus ministry, and we just stole him without apology.
But honestly, Chris, there's not very many big churches in Canada either, and so there's just not hordes of associate jobs or assistant jobs or just a lot of that stuff doesn't really exist. And so you finish your internship, you're done your seminary. It's like you kind of either plant or Like there's just not a lot else. I mean, now that Dan's church is huge, he hires a lot of people, but like everyone else, like we're just sort of, you kind of push people like, all right, like think about it, like maybe we can do something. And so that's definitely been a part of it.
Hey, so, Ben, Ottawa's Canada's national capital. How many youth pastors are there in Ottawa that you know? I bet you there's like 5. It just doesn't exist.
Like maybe a dozen if I really went around and counted up carefully. A city of 1 million people,
Yeah.
So
such a different place.
Yeah.
But something that has come out of some of our churches as well is that some of those guys who are not necessarily planters have developed a vision for a church, being part of a church planting ecosystem. So some of the interns that you're like, well, they're not necessarily a planter, but have that vision, want to play a part. So they have ended up at some of the other churches and, you're seeing some renewal stuff going on, or they're going to, be the second guy at a plant when they need to hire that next guy. So there are some good stuff that's going on, even with those who are not planting, though. I mean, I agree. I mean, it's not like there's all these associate jobs out there at this stage.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you guys I got a bunch of interns right now that could take the associate jobs and are looking. So I think I'm about to seed all these Baptist churches with great associate pastors. If you guys don't step up and start helping hire some of these guys for me.
So so there's, again, this is great news. What are some of the challenges that you're facing with this kind of growth that you're having to be aware of? And I mean, one of it is, you keep raising people up. Planting is going to be primary option. Of course, it's not for everybody. So how do we get them in? But anything else?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting because I think the numbers themselves that we said are encouraging. It's nice to see churches planted, but I think Ed Stetzer quote that you mentioned where it says that it takes a lot longer to plant a church in Canada, that's also true. So they're sort of both and. So it's like we see our churches off the ground, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're soaring or that they've got all their answers in a row. And it's actually extremely difficult. And so it's very tenuous as far as how those plants are going. So the challenge is, is that every plant that started, it's a long ride and that you don't know how it's going to go. And so there's some needs there as far as just the stick-to-itiveness that's required to staying in a community and keeping at it with the church. And even when you take a risk of sending someone out to go plant another thing, they're never sent with as much resources as perhaps I've seen in the U.S. and things. And so it's a bit of a risk every time to do such a thing.
Yeah. So what does that runway look like? What's kind of the typical or the norm? Or if I was coming up there, I want to plant a church and have it particularized in 3 years and have a $500,000 budget by year 4.
Well, we would laugh at you
wake me up.
You'd be the first.
Yeah. No. What's the wake up call?
John Smed.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Dan.
John Smed told me. He said, go.
I was going to say, one of the things about particularizing is you have to assume you're going to have no one who has any PCA church background. So you want to find elders, great. You have to train everyone from scratch.
Yeah.
Now you might have some like reformed-ish people. Like we got some Dutch people. We got some other like the Scotch, psalm singers. We got a few of those things, but like there's no one who has a distinctly PCA kind of missional culture, and so. None of my elders have any background in the PCA. And so we had to go through a pretty extensive training process to make sure we're all on the same page.
Yeah.
And so really, I mean, we moved pretty quickly, but for me to be particularized at 5 years was like, oh, wow, that's like sooner than you ought to assume. Like, I think like a 7-year runway is sort of, unless you're like a daughter church with a lot of people from like an existing PCA church, which is mostly only happening in Toronto right now. That's sort of the run. Is that about right for where you are, Scott? Like 7 years, 8 years, maybe?
Yep, that's right. Yeah, 7 years, and we had one guy who knew the PCA, the other guy did not, and it's definitely the case where every membership class we do, it's me explaining what a PCA is, and so it's and by the way, we're Presbyterian. This is a thing. So it's training from scratch and a lot of the distinctives of what we believe and where we're coming from. And people love that we preach the Bible, and they love that we're pointing people to Christ. They love that we come from some form of theological structure that binds these things together. But Westminster Confession of Faith, that stuff's new. Like, so it is
a
new way to do
there's no
ministry.
ecosystem, is there, guys? There's no ecosystem to support us. I think you're the godfather of ecosystems, Chris. So we really could use you just maybe, helping us out a little bit here. But seriously, there's no elders. Campus ministry. You get all these kids from the campus. They have been trained in a very mainstream evangelical theology. They're usually quite wary to hostile to our brand of complementarianism. Let's not even talk about the doctrine of election. That one, it's a grind. It's a total grind. You're starting from scratch with everybody. So there's no existing pipeline to take advantage of. You're creating your own pipeline all the time. I remember talking to Mr. McDowell over here, and we just said, what's the number one issue? We're having one of our board meetings, and we looked at each other, and he said, pipeline. I went, pipeline. We just don't have it. We don't have RUF in Canada. And we're trying to figure out even how we can bring them up. We just, everything that you guys can take for granted denominationally. You have seminaries that actually believe in the Reformed distinctives and elder-led churches. I don't know that do we have a seminary left in 2 of them, maybe in Canada?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, and at least one of those is a very small denominational seminary for another denomination. So, but I think the other thing that we see is, we are getting guys. Dan has numerous interns. I've got a few. So Ben has interns. Scott has an apprentice. We are seeing that we are able to cast vision, and over time, it's not necessarily quick again, but raise up interns that some of them turn into church planting apprentices, which hopefully turn into planters. Others are have heard about the PCA or Keller or someone like that, or Red Center Church, or got connected through the incubator from another denomination. There are various places that we are connecting with people, but it's not this massive surge anywhere in any one place. Though there have been some interesting stories. I think of Kitchener-Waterloo, where a guy came who was on staff at a major charismatic church, started going to seminary, and actually no, even before, his wife started reading Reformed theology and ended up at a Reformed thing, but kind of accidentally, as he put it, planted a church because a group came with him that were, as he was preaching about what he was believing and talking about it, they wanted to be a part of this, but essentially came to Dan and was like, I've got these people I feel responsible for, but I'm in seminary, I'm a ways from being ordained. Help. So, and that's actually an example of a place where a presbytery can't really work with them in quite the same way, but a network can. So functionally, Dan and I became his elders over a period, and, consultants in that, and walked alongside during a time where, began working with him in the presbytery setting and all of that as well, and moving it over a long period of time towards particularizing. Now, he would have particularized had COVID not hit. We're waiting for when that will happen. But, it's been a beautiful story of kind of thinking and painting outside the box on some of that, where that would be much more difficult in a presbytery setting, though, the presbytery was working with us again. Or I think of New City, Toronto. One of our planters was looking to plant, from a Chinese background, met 2 other Chinese churches as he was scoping out Toronto that were also looking to plant 2 Chinese Baptist churches of 2 different Chinese Baptist denominations. Long story short, there was a partnership that became, we supplied a planter and coaching, they supplied funds and some people, and beginning, so there's just some interesting stories of recruiting is not necessarily the typical runway. And the others are very much the typical path of what you would see in some other places in the States as well.
Well, the intern at our church right now is a RTS Jackson grad, but who like sort of accidentally married a Canadian who came down for classes. We sent one of our young women down, and she came back with a husband. She's like, he came up, he wanted to work in Canada, and so like he emails me out of the blue, like, hey, can I be an intern? I'm trying to like learn about this. I'm sort of interested in church planting. I married this Quebecois girl, and so we're like, great. So now Frankie is like an intern at our church. And so sometimes you kind of get those out of the blue things, but
that's a whole different recruitment strategy I've heard before.
We're developing
young
that
women
one
to
in
draw
secret.
them back.
Yeah.
I'm not going to make an Old Testament analogy there, but it sounds good.
We're pretty resourceful up here, Mike.
How often do you look at recruiting someone from the States, and does that work? I mean, I would think it has other hurdles that makes it more prudent to raise up your own. Is that a correct?
Yeah. I'd say it's really hard. Unless there's a direct connection to Canada, either by means of marriage or some people go to seminary down there, so that, they disappear to St. Louis or Orlando or whatever, to do seminary, and then we can kind of sometimes get them back. But the problem is that, like, going back to your question about, can I plant in 3 years and have a $500,000 budget? Like, our budget still at 7 years is $350,000, and so like just the financial resources to say to an intern, hey, come and work for me for 2 years. I got it. I have a full ride ready for you. It's like, I can throw something your way, but I'm not gonna be able to fund you totally. And so it is difficult to, I think when prime church planting candidates are sort of given like, here's 7 or 8 options, like ours just aren't that attractive. Why don't you learn how to be an immigrant and raise some money? And, and so you're right. I think like the more normal path is people coming from either campus ministries, or other kinds of things, or they did seminary online from a distance over a couple of years or something like that.
Yeah. So. And I met some of your guys down at RTS Orlando through the hybrid program.
Yeah.
That's right. Exactly. And even though we have a guy at our church right now going through as a distance student, and so not Frankie, but another guy. And so it's pretty common. It's what I did actually too. Now 8 or 9 years ago, worked at Dan's church and did seminary from a distance.
And I mean, it's different, but there's the similarities here in Wisconsin. Recruiting somebody to come from Wisconsin, it's tough because they understand that there's still snow on the ground in April, and that scares off most PCA guys.
Oh yeah,
and
snow on the ground in January scares off many.
Yeah, well, yeah, the word snow is bad.
But weather seriously has been an obstacle in many places of recruiting someone up, or an American coming up and leaving planting early to go back down. And there's times you're like, well, there's a call's a call. You have to follow Christ in this. But that on our end, that's kind of a challenge. On the other hand, someone like Scott did come from the South, and
and Kyle.
Kyle. I mean, so we do have Americans that have come up and are playing a leading role in planting and in the church, on a bigger scene in their area as well. So, I mean, Americans absolutely welcome.
But I would say this, guys, that in both, I think Scott's case and in Kyle's case, they don't just have a church planters call, they have a missionary call.
Yes.
Very different. Kyle was ready to go to Europe if he needed to as a missionary with MTW. It was that sort of cultural agility and willingness to reach very unreached places. And Scotty has the same missionary call. So I think for Americans who want to come up, you want that kind of, not just a lot of cultural agility, but you don't just need a church planters call. We feel like maybe more of a missionary call would be a better way to describe it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think, Ben was correct that we probably have a pipeline that needs to continually be addressed in Canada and continue to make that work because that's the easiest and best way forward. But, I was in Africa and started listening to Tim Keller's sermons in Kenya and felt like I needed to be in a Western part of the world in this city. Because I was in the Bible Belt again, where I was working in Africa, and there's needs there, but they're different. And I'd say the same thing happens with American brothers and sisters who see there's needs in other parts of the Western world too that could use help and are willing to do what it takes to sort of get into a new part of the world, learn a new culture, and know that being an American isn't an asset. Like it's that's sort of what I've realized is, I love being able to immigrate in Canada and have two nationalities, two citizenships, but But the reality is like, yeah, you sort of jettison a lot of things that you don't really need culturally anymore to engage into a new land and love a new people. So it is required to sort of, as Americans come up to serve, is to sort of let some of that stuff go and to join into what being Canadian is.
Yeah.
I think there's some truth in that in certain regions of Canada as well. I mean, I think of the Maritimes. We sent a planter out, Mike Changer and his wife Brittany, went from Ben's church. Is in the process of gathering. COVID has slowed some of that down, but it essentially has to have a missionary call there, but with a bigger vision to raise up Maritimers who are going to be far more effective because of some particular cultural dynamics that are going on. If long term, what's going to need to happen is Indigenous Maritimers, not even just Canadians going there, but I think Maritimers far more. Quebec, to some degree, would be very much similar in that regard as well.
Yeah.
Other areas of Canada, that wouldn't be an issue of going somewhere else. But there are particular areas. I think the North would be like that as well, in some of those more northern, smaller communities that over the decades, I pray that we get to plant some vibrant churches into. So, I mean, I think that missionary call is there in a number of, there's a number of dynamics there potentially as well.
Yeah. There was a question, and Ben, you answered, but I just want to pick up if there's any other discussion as far as kind of creating a war chest to bankroll internships. It's a great concept. I would assume you're not going to find that as much internally in the Grace Network, but looking to point south. Have you had any, how's that communication going? Is that much movement at all? We
had a guy who was really going to help us raise funds. It was terrific. We finally found kind of a champion in the States. His name's Paul Hahn. You may know him. Then he took another gig, and so we lost that champion. So we have had a little bit of success southwards, I think.
Well, Conan should talk about the partnership he has. I don't know if you want to name names, but to talk a little bit, you have had some success.
I'm happy. I mean, Oak Mountain in Birmingham, Alabama, has partnered with us both in giving to the network, but also sending up short-term missionaries. It's a great missionary sending church in a variety of ways, but have sent up short-term missions, for a week or two at a time, with kids camps and some other stuff that early church plants were like, we do not have the manpower resources to carry that off. But it really boosts, especially in kind of that family demographic, to allow us to do some things far earlier on. So they've been a blessing, in conversation with another church or two down there. But most of our funds comes from either churches or some individuals who've given, in some cases very sacrificially and very generously to this, and continue to work that. I mean, I think both at presbytery levels, the presbyteries are working at developing war chests for that, but also, for us as a network, we do fund internships, so prior assessment, to help that out a little bit, because most of our interns, like Ben said, are having to raise some money for that. But then, helping a little bit more with apprentices, those who have been assessed to plant and working towards that next step, and then helping fund plants as well. So, I mean, I think we've got the beginning of that, whereas a number of years ago, we were not able to do that. But, I think there's a lot more room for us to grow in that funding stream. I mean, you could say that about the training stream, the recruiting. I mean, all of this. Yeah. We need to grow. We need to learn. We're working. We're trying.
Yeah.
That's something. At the same time, God's been faithful.
Yeah. I think as I said earlier, I'm impressed. I mean, the incubator, you're going to be, Lord willing, this fall, I think November, whatever, looking at doing an assessment up there, and I think, doing that makes a big difference, because that in and of itself is a recruiting tool, rather than saying, hey, why don't you go down to Boca Raton to do an assessment? It's owning that, I think, is great. As far as that pipeline goes, I noticed on your site the summer experience. Now, last summer, probably this summer, not. But what is that? And because that seems to be an earlier component of the pipeline. It's not an intern, not an apprentice. You're pushing it back further, which is really healthy. What's the summer experience and how has that worked?
It's a good idea at this point.
Okay, it's a good idea. So you haven't failed yet. Keep going.
Yeah, that's we tried it. We've had one or two. Scott's looking at having one or two December. We actually exchanged an email about it this morning.
Oh.
And so yeah, it's just trying to figure out, like, the young people who are in our churches. Like, is there a chance for us to do something with them over the summer to give them just like a little taste of ministry? We had a young woman who interned with us. We made her take like a seminary course, like just begin to feel out like what like vocational ministry is like before you kind of go away and do something else. And so we're trying to figure out, can we craft these, 2-month, 3-month, if you have a university or college student, you can get them for maybe 3 or 4 months. Can we craft something that would really give them like a taste and not just like administrative things and not just kids camp, unless that's what they're excited about, but it's like, to do some real stuff and to go somewhere, maybe to visit a few different church plants, or that's kind of the thinking behind it. But yeah, it's very much like an idea phase and stuff like that right now.
Hey Ben, we tried it actually. I was
talking, did you?
I was talking to Joe about it, and Joe just decided to go for someone different. He's our assistant pastor, and Joe found a pediatrics resident who was about to set up his pediatrics. Actually, he's doing a fellowship at Sick Kids, and he was just about to do his practice, but he had 3 months off. So he said, why don't you take 3 months and do a summer internship with us? It was actually a spring internship, and run Faith and Work for us. Yeah.
Yeah, good.
Yeah. So the guy ran Faith and Work, and now he wants to do it part-time while he is a doctor. So, it can bear fruit. Most of them have not worked it nearly that well, but that was a fun innovation by Joe, trying something.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right, Chris. I think we have to start further back. I think Mike Avancic commented up higher about the need for a pipeline too. And it's just like this is our thinking: is how do we get young people interested in ministry? Obviously, the internal call has to be there, but like, is there things that we can throw at people to be like, hey, are you feeling like a little tug? I don't think young people have traditionally sensed a pathway in the church of like, I want to dip my toe in it before I go to seminary, before I do the other things, and there hasn't really been much in that way, I don't think, traditionally.
Yeah, Ben, don't you think the international projects used to serve that bit of that for
totally for college students, university students?
Yeah. We have a bunch of people talking about doing a little international project. If we can get over the present sort of pushback against them as being exploitive, et cetera, and figure out a way to do it, we feel like they can be really vision building. It's an old idea, maybe recycled.
Yeah. No, there was a statistic I often like to quote from a Barna poll back in 2017, and found that 50% of all Protestant pastors first sensed the call to ministry between the ages of 14 and 21.
Interesting.
And, again, like I think as you're saying, how do they act on it? They don't. They go, well, that's nice. Now I'm going to go to university. And for a lot of them going in debt, and I can't do seminary. And so I think for us to be attuned in our churches, kind of what you're saying with Mike and in Halifax and the Maritime, to be able to say the best people to reach this area are people from this area. How can we begin to talk to them as even as teenagers to think kingdom engagement, men and women, in a much broader way?
And I think some of that, just comes in the everyday that we preach, that we interact with teens, catechism classes or membership classes where you're involving younger people. It's talking about some of these things. It's not putting up church planters or pastors necessarily up on a pedestal they don't belong on. On the other hand, it's encouraging them to dream and think missionally and pray that way and participate in their lives in all these opportunities around them. And then, as some of them feel and sense that call, begin to work with them in these more structured ways as well. But I think it starts, it's not even just the structured program. We need to begin to think in these bigger terms and categories and work way back on that. And that's the challenge. On the other hand, it's the beautiful thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, there's so so many times that somebody comes into the church and they pick up a Reformed theology book for the first time, and like you can see like this new fire light in them. I wish I would see it more in the church, but just recently had one this summer of a guy I didn't even know he was reading books, and all of a sudden he's like reading 10 books and wants to steal my bookshelf and all the rest, and thinks he wants to be a professor. But the problem is he keeps trying to tell all his friends about Jesus, and is actually pretty good at trying to develop little relationships with people and connect the dots for people and that kind of stuff. And he just sort of has this desire, but he's never served in the church like his whole life. He just participated in coming on a Sunday, and then all of a sudden this fire's there.
Wow.
And so it's a matter of like sort of working with people like that and be like, we want you to take the front row. Like we want you in, and we got a place for you to serve. And he might need to go to seminary, he might need to go to school, but he probably just needs to serve in the church and like do stuff, so that's where some of the early parts of the pipeline develop in a healthy church environment.
Yeah. I noticed here, so the conversation, Dan, talking about the RTS scholarship of getting a third off with the church partnership, where you get 2/3 off, and if the church contributes another third, dividing it that way. The one thing I'd say, what we've seen here in Wisconsin, we went from 0 to 25 students in Wisconsin in 4 years, and it was largely that relationship with RTS and now with Covenant, where they're giving a 50% discount. And then of that remaining 50%, if they're in a next gen cohort. So shameless plug. Sorry, there it is. I have to do it each episode, or my board gets
plug
on.
away. Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
But no, with that next gen cohort, but then our presbytery will cover of that remaining third, a third. The church will contribute a third. The student pays a third. So it ends up being about $2,000 a year for 5 years. For the presbytery, great. For the church, US dollar, sorry. And then that way, which it does make it affordable, but it also keeps them in this cohort, which is nice. They're engaging with guys outside of their own network, which is great.
Yeah, sounds awesome.
Well, all the disadvantages of the distance learning of not healthy seminaries, and there's been many discussions about planting a seminary or two in Canada. I think one of the good things that in the distance thing is this cohort kind of idea, or this internship where they're actually in not just learning academically, abstract ways, but actually putting it into practice in real ministry settings and opportunities, not just, administrating something, but real opportunities begins to take that seminary education and apply it in a very different way as well. So.
Yeah. I like talking about a three-legged stool. There's the academic, there's the on-the-job training, there's a character formation that's more mentored than taught. But having all three of those are important context. We got about 10, 13 minutes left. Briefly, how would you describe the cultural climate in Canada? What would help those to your south kind of get a better sense of what's happening in Canada? What's the challenge, but also what's exciting? What are the opportunities that you're seeing and having?
Dan, take that away.
I tell people that Toronto to New York is like New York to Atlanta in terms of spiritual openness to the gospel. And when Americans hear that, their jaws drop. They think New York is the epicenter of secularism. I've talked to a bunch of people at Redeemer. There was a guy at Redeemer, came to Canada in 6 months of living in New York at Redeemer. He'd taken 9 of his coworkers to church. In 12 months of going to Canada, living in Canada, he'd gotten 0 people interested. It's just that much more secular. So you just we're moving from a passive aggressive hostility towards Christianity, in my opinion, toward an active aggressive hostility towards Christianity in Canada. So it's just a very different thing. So on the one hand, Christians really have to count the cost, and they're closeting all over the place. It's the only word I can think of. All kinds of my Christians at their large organizations have to put their beliefs in a closet to be sustained. I did a small group on faith and work, and 6 of the 12 said they would be either demoted or fired people actually knew what they believed. So I think to me, that's the big one. It's a challenge for discipleship. We have to change the way we disciple. However, intriguingly, as it gets so aggressively hostile to Christianity, a weird kind of curiosity is growing, kind of an underneath the headlines curiosity about the gospel. And also, as the culture gets nastier, people are seeing Christians' basic love to each other in really powerful ways. So I feel like it's going to be more persecution and more conversions. That's my best guess for the next 10 years.
Okay.
Well, I think that like when I went to plant a church, I talked to so many people who literally had never met like a young Christian before. It's like, oh, you're a Christian pastor. I don't know any pastors like your age. I'm not like young. I was in like my mid 30s or whatever, but it was like, wow, that's just so interesting.
Yeah.
I haven't met any. I thought all priests were old, and so it's very much like you become like this weird curiosity of someone who takes their faith seriously. Like there's not many people who do that, and so so that was one thing I noticed all over a bunch of times in planting a church.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I get questions about ghosts. I get questions about, their weird dreams. Those are the spiritual questions of neighbors when they find out that I'm a pastor. And so there's a loss of biblical memory. So none of the Bible characters are really known, and the gospel. I would say it's interesting. So we're probably not as an urban context as Toronto, but it's still just post-Christian, and in that post-Christianity, it is sort of forgotten that it needs to be angry at the Christians. It's just forgotten Christians are around, and so that is actually creating in many kinds of early conversations a peaceability towards the first steps of sharing faith, where they're just like, well, that's good for you, like I didn't realize that there were still Christians around, and I don't know what you really believe. But then the animosity comes when there becomes specific moral questions or of differences. But it does sort of liberate the first early conversations of just like, man, I didn't realize people were still doing Christianity. So there's that.
That's so true.
Some of that depends region to region too. When I moved from Western Canada east, I saw more of the active aggression than I did in the West, where there was a little more of that disbelief that in many places, especially Vancouver, where I was at one point, there's like, oh, I didn't, exactly what Scott described, I didn't realize Christians. Whereas in Hamilton, in my neighborhood, there's far more of, there's the people who've forgotten, but there's also the people who've consciously rejected it. Not that what they're rejecting is actual Christianity, but a very sad stereotype and distortion of it. So you end up in some very interesting places. The thing that I found in my context is publicly talking about being a Christian is when they're in a group, it's aggressive. In fact, there's just stories like, wow, that was an aggressive conversation.
Yeah.
Privately, there's a lot more of that curiosity that Dan was describing and openness. If your life matches up with what you're talking about and you begin to dismantle this stereotype of Christianity and faith as just, this uber do-gooder, self-righteous person, and actually get it down to talking about grace. I think of one of my neighbors where he just went on a rant for almost an hour about all the things he hated about Christianity. And at the end of it, I said, look, I actually think Jesus would agree with you on 90% of what you said. He actually spoke very specifically about some of those same things. So if you're going to actually reject Christianity, as a Christian pastor, I feel a very strong moral obligation to help you reject it well, which completely blew his category. But it's ended up, in these conversations and had those with others too, is like, well, let's actually talk about what the gospel is. Let's actually talk about who Jesus is, because that's not who they're thinking it is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh.
I can say one other positive thing. There's not very much cultural Christianity because of the antagonism, because of the resistance. It's like most people who come to my church like really want to be there, and they're actually fairly serious about their faith. And they still need to be discipled in all sorts of ways. Like I think what Dan said is right. but like there's just not a lot of people who go because their mom expects them to, or to fit in with friends. Like that just doesn't exist, that kind of cultural pressure.
Yeah.
And so I have very few cultural Christians.
Yeah.
So that's sort of like the upside, is I'm not dealing with some of those kind of questions of making people figure out if they're in or out. Like they're in because they're there because they're in, and like that, that really matters.
Yeah. No, that's
Well, church attendance is overall, especially in urban centers, very low. So they're not like I'm saying there's no social pressure towards that. In fact, you're really a weird anomaly if that's happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, just kind of a wrapping up question. I want to hear the dreams, thinking audaciously. It's 10 years down the road. The stay-at-home order has been lifted. Sometime
No, I think it's still going.
The previous week, maybe.
Sorry, we didn't bring COVID up too much in this conversation.
Thank you.
Oh, that's not. Yeah.
No, it's 10 years down the road. What's happened with the Grace Network? What's your dreams? This is what I would like to see. Go wild. I can
go first. I think that as Conan talked about earlier about the gaps, there's still a couple of provinces that don't have any PCA churches. And so I'd love to see a PCA church in Quebec, in Newfoundland, in PEI, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, some of the territories. Like, I think that would be really important. That'd be really meaningful to us being a national network. But that really is going to require us to plant 7 more churches or so in really difficult places where we don't have, there's going to be no core group to draw on, no local resources. They're going to be these parachute plants, in all likelihood. And so, but that's something that comes to mind for me as like 10 years. It would be great if we were at that kind of place.
So in 10 years, seven churches in hard places.
Yeah.
In addition to multiplication in the churches that are already planted, but I agree with Ben, and some of those, which is what's happened in the Toronto area, becoming hubs for planting, where there's a little bit, at least the beginning of developing an ecosystem for planting and cooperation and partnering together and support for one another. That's going to be important, where those regions, they're geographically very distant from one another. And sometimes, there's a distinct subculture in that region that's, different from some other places. So I think some of that's very important to get into some of those places, plant. And it's not just, we're here to plant a church. We're here to plant the beginning of an ecosystem that we can recruit and develop people that will plant into other places, and hopefully many of them that are PCA and others that may not be, but that are faithful, gospel preaching, vibrant churches as well.
So you wanted me to dream? So
yeah.
I have a dream.
Let's hear it.
I have a dream that in 2030, there will be a church planting cathedral church that's a hub and has an internship program in Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, Halifax, Calgary, Hamilton, Victoria, and Vancouver. And that we're regularly planting out of those hubs 1 to 2 churches a year. So that we're getting somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 churches a year pretty regularly, expanding out from those key cities. That there's an RUF Canada in Toronto, Ottawa, Halifax, Hamilton, Vancouver and Victoria, and at maybe Calgary. And that we are starting to have a real pipeline of young people happening. I pray that we would have our own retreat center and a seminary, RTS Canada, maybe 2, maybe 1 in your city and 1 somewhere else, Ben. So
now you make me feel bad about my lack of faith. If you can that would be.
No, I mean, we need ecosystems, man. We need these hubs. One of the things about Canada is it's so spread out. What we found is having Conan and I within an hour of each other, a little clustered concentration of people with these kinds of ideas and willingness to help and mentor each other and support each other really created a hub. And then Ben was an intern here. Kyle was an intern through that process, and a bunch of other people. We were able to mentor the guy in Kitchener-Waterloo and to some degree Albert. But we needed a clustered hub, and we need some help for Scotty. He's out there all by himself on the West Coast. we need some synergy for the guy.
Mm.
But I think if his intern turns out to be the guy we hope he is, we got a shot there too. And then there's potential in Calgary just because there is a Christian ecosystem there, unlike most places, if we can just find the right leader. And then Montreal, of course, just needs somebody because it's Montreal. But I feel like if we have these regional hubs really cooking, we can really do something powerful.
Yeah. Well, something great to be praying for, just maybe even specifically, as you were saying, those regional hubs, and just for anyone in the States, if they can name any province or any major city in any one of those places, that would be a place to start, and to be able to do that. Well, that's great. Well, guys, any closing thoughts or words? All right.
We covet your prayers.
Yeah.
We really do. I mean, this is going to be, it's a big dream. There's lots of obstacles, but there's massive opportunity. There's 30 some million Canadians of the close to, 37 and a half, 38 million that clearly do not understand the gospel or not connected to a vibrant church. Pray for us and pray for other churches and denominations as well, that God would be raising up leaders and people that would be sharing their faith, vibrant and living it out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that is great. Well, let me pray for you, and then I'll close us out. Gracious Father, we are indeed grateful for your mercy and your grace and all that you have been doing there in Canada, across all the provinces. Lord, we pray that you would continue that work as you raise up leaders, give health and strength to the leaders that are here now, and longevity, so that we would see that pipeline developing and new planters, and that each of those major cities across Canada would become a hub of church planting, and create and see a movement, Lord, we pray, over these next 10 years. We ask all of this in your Son's name. Amen. All right, guys. Well, thanks so much. We will be back in 2 weeks looking at BALM, what's a seminary program taking place in Baltimore, and how raising up leaders in a non-traditional context and raising a diversity of leaders. We'll be doing that in 2 weeks from now. If you've been attending, I'll be sending out this link and some other information to you as well. And so until then, thank you very much, and thank you for joining M&A Conversations.